I'm Rear Admiral Lexi Hale, 51 years old, and I built my career from the ground up. Annapolis graduate, combat aviator, and now one of the few women to hold flag rank in naval intelligence. For years, I supported my father, financially, emotionally, even covering his mistakes, because I believed loyalty to family was as sacred as loyalty to country. But when he accused me of treason in front of my peers and took pride in doing it, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been betrayed by the one person you spent your life trying to make proud? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to stand your ground after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries, integrity, and rebuilding after betrayal. What happened next might surprise you. I grew up in a house where loyalty meant obedience, especially to my father, Richard Hale, a retired Army colonel who believed hierarchy was the only form of love. My earliest memories are of standing at attention in our living room while he inspected my school uniform, checking that my collar was straight and my shoes were polished. He never said, "Good morning" or "I love you." He said, "Carry on" or "Dismissed." My mother would watch from the kitchen doorway, her expression somewhere between sympathy and resignation, but she never intervened. In his world, there was no room for softness, only standards. I learned early that achievement was the currency of his affection. When I brought home straight A's in elementary school, he'd nod once and say, "That's expected, not exceptional." When I made captain of my high school debate team, he asked why I hadn't also joined Model UN. When I received my acceptance letter to the Naval Academy at Annapolis, he looked at the envelope for a long moment before saying, "We'll see if you can handle it." I was 17 years old, and I still believed that someday, somehow, I would do something that would make him proud. Annapolis was brutal in ways he'd never warned me about. The physical training, the academic rigor, the constant pressure to prove yourself worthy of the uniform, I thrived on all of it, perhaps because it felt like home. I graduated in the top 10% of my class, earned my commission as an ensign, and moved on to flight school in Pensacola. I wanted to fly jets, wanted to feel that combination of skill and courage that defined naval aviation. My father attended my commissioning ceremony, but left before the reception. When I called him that night, he said, "Lot of people graduate from Annapolis. Let's see what you do with it." I did everything. I flew training missions until my hands knew the controls better than they knew anything else. I deployed to the Persian Gulf on a carrier, logging hundreds of flight hours in conditions that tested every bit of training I'd ever received. I wrote him letters from the ship, describing the work, the crew, the sense of purpose that came from serving something larger than myself. He never wrote back, but my mother would call occasionally to tell me he'd mentioned receiving them. "He keeps them in his office," she said once, and I held on to that detail like a lifeline. When I made lieutenant junior grade at 24, I called to tell him. He said, "That's automatic. Everyone makes LTJG." When I screened for department head and earned my promotion to full lieutenant at 27, he said, "You're benefiting from the diversity push. They need to promote women." When my mother died suddenly of an aneurysm during my second deployment, I took emergency leave and flew home to find him standing in their bedroom, staring at her empty side of the closet. For a moment, I thought grief might soften him. Instead, he turned to me and said, "She always worried you worked too hard. I told her you were just doing what you had to do." I paid for her funeral. I paid for the reception afterward. When his small consulting business, advising defense contractors on military protocol, began to fail a year later, I quietly sent him money each month. When I learned he'd lost his military health insurance due to an administrative error, I added him to my own policy and handled the paperwork. When he asked me to co-sign a loan for his house, I did it without hesitation. He never said thank you. He would call every few months with advice that sounded like orders. "You need to be more strategic about your next assignment. You need to network with the right people. You need to understand that competence isn't enough." I listened because I still believed that somewhere underneath the criticism and the coldness, there was a father who loved me. I believed that if I kept serving my country and him, I would eventually earn not just his respect, but his affection. My commanding officer saw something in me that he refused to acknowledge. I was selected for the Naval Postgraduate School, earned a master's degree in strategic intelligence, and by 31, I'd made lieutenant commander. I was chosen for increasingly sensitive assignments, working in naval intelligence on operations I couldn't discuss even with my closest friends. During those years, my relationship with him became a strange, one-sided ritual. I would call on holidays and his birthday. I would send him updates about my career milestones. I would ask about his health, his business, his life. He would respond with questions that felt like interrogations. Are you being careful about who you trust? Are you sure you're not being used for political purposes? Are you certain your loyalty is in the right place? I told myself he was just being protective, that his military background made him cautious by nature. When I made commander at 34, a rank that typically came later in a career, I was assigned to a classified intelligence unit that coordinated between naval operations and other government agencies. The work was intense, demanding, and often invisible to the outside world. I couldn't tell my father what I did, where I went, or who I worked with. When he asked about my assignment, I gave him the standard line, "It's classified. I'm not at liberty to discuss it." He laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You think you're in some spy movie? You think you're James Bond now?" I tried to explain that secrecy was part of the job, that I'd taken an oath. He said, "You took an oath to family first. Blood before flags." That conversation was the first time I felt genuine unease about his view of me. It wasn't just disapproval anymore, it was something darker, something that questioned my fundamental loyalty. But I pushed the feeling aside. He was my father. He was a veteran who'd served his country with distinction. He was entitled to his opinions, even if they hurt. I told myself that time would prove my commitment to both him and my service. I told myself that eventually, he would see that the two weren't in conflict. I told myself that the next promotion, the next achievement, the next proof of my dedication would finally be enough. I was wrong about all of it, but I didn't know that yet. I just kept serving, kept striving, kept hoping that someday he would look at me in my uniform and see a daughter worth being proud of. As I rose through the ranks, from lieutenant to lieutenant commander to commander, my relationship with my father shifted in ways I didn't immediately recognize. The change was gradual, like a tide that erodes a shoreline so slowly you don't notice until the landscape has fundamentally altered. By my mid-30s, I'd achieved more than most officers dreamed of: multiple commendations, leadership positions in high-level intelligence operations, and the respect of my peers and superiors. My father's response to each milestone grew increasingly cold, but the nature of his criticism changed. It was no longer about my competence or my achievements. It became about my loyalty, specifically my loyalty to him. The first real warning sign came when I was 36 and serving as a commander in a joint intelligence task force. I'd been home for a brief visit, and we were sitting in his kitchen, the same kitchen where my mother used to make Sunday dinners, now cluttered with newspapers and half-empty coffee mugs. He was reading something on his tablet, and without looking up, he said, "You've been in long enough. When are you going to think about what you owe your family?" I asked what he meant. He set the tablet down and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not disappointment, but something closer to betrayal. "You chose the Navy over blood," he said. "Every promotion takes you further from the people who actually matter." I tried to explain that my service wasn't a rejection of family, that I was honoring the same values he'd taught me. He cut me off. "I taught you loyalty. You learned careerism." The conversation ended there, but the accusation hung between us like smoke. In the months that followed, he began calling less frequently, and when we did speak, there was an edge to his questions that felt invasive. He wanted to know details about my work that I couldn't share, and my refusal to discuss classified operations only seemed to confirm his suspicions that I was hiding something, not because of national security, but because of personal disloyalty. When I was promoted to captain at 3906, the rank he'd never achieved despite a full career in the Army, something in him broke. I called to tell him about the promotion, expecting the usual lukewarm congratulations. Instead, there was a long silence on the line. Then he said, "Captain. That's what they call it in the Navy." His voice was flat. You outrank me now. Is that what you wanted? I told him it wasn't about rank, that my career wasn't a competition with his. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Everything's a competition, Lexi. You just didn't realize we were in one. He came to the promotion ceremony, which surprised me. He sat in the back, his posture rigid, his face expressionless. Afterward, during the reception, he approached me in front of several of my colleagues. He shook my hand formally, congratulated me in a voice loud enough for others to hear, and said all the things a proud father should say. Then, as he leaned in for what looked like an embrace, he whispered in my ear, "You'll never be more than a pawn in their game. They're using you, and you're too blind to see it." I stepped back, my smile frozen in place, and he walked away. I didn't see him again for 6 months. During that time, he began listening to talk radio, conservative shows that trafficked in conspiracy theories about government corruption, deep state operatives, and military officers who'd supposedly betrayed their oaths. I learned this from a cousin who'd visited him and found his living room dominated by a radio tuned to these programs, playing constantly. When I called to check on him, he'd quote things he'd heard, claims about officers selling intelligence, about Pentagon insiders undermining national security, about a military elite that had more loyalty to international interests than to American citizens. I tried to engage him rationally, to point out the difference between legitimate criticism and paranoid fantasy. He accused me of being brainwashed. Family gatherings became battlegrounds. At my cousin's wedding, he cornered me during the reception and launched into a monologue about military accountability, about officers who thought they were above oversight, about the dangers of classified work that nobody could verify or question. He wasn't yelling, my father never yelled, but his voice carried, and I could feel other family members watching us. I kept my responses measured and quiet, refusing to be drawn into an argument. That only seemed to frustrate him more. You can't even defend yourself, he said. You hide behind classification and protocols. That's not honor. That's cowardice. I excused myself and spent the rest of the evening avoiding him. The pattern continued for 2 years. He would bait me with political arguments designed to humiliate me, always in settings where I couldn't fully respond without causing a scene. He questioned my judgment, my integrity, my commitment to the Constitution. He began telling relatives that I'd changed, that the military had turned me into someone he didn't recognize. One uncle pulled me aside at Thanksgiving and said, "Your dad's struggling with something. He's proud of you, but he doesn't know how to show it anymore." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to think that underneath the hostility was simply a father who couldn't process his daughter's success. But the evidence suggested something darker. By the time I was 41, I'd been selected for Rear Admiral lower half, the first flag rank at 07. It was an honor that came to fewer than 1% of officers, and it required Senate confirmation. The process involved extensive background checks, interviews, and public scrutiny. During that period, I received a call from a naval intelligence officer I'd worked with years earlier, Captain Mark Danner. "We need to talk," he said. "In person. Not over the phone." We met at a coffee shop near the Pentagon, and he slid a folder across the table. Inside were printouts of forum posts and blog comments, conspiracy theories about naval intelligence operations, about specific classified programs, about me. The posts didn't use my name directly, but they referenced details that could only have come from someone with knowledge of my assignment history. "Do you know who might have access to this kind of information?" Mark asked. I looked through the posts, my stomach sinking. The details were vague enough to avoid classification violations, but specific enough to be dangerous. Then I saw a comment that mentioned my hometown, my father's military service, even a reference to blood loyalty. I closed the folder. "I have an idea," I said. Mark's expression was carefully neutral. "We're not investigating you, but we need to understand the source. If there's a security concern," I cut him off. "I'll handle it." He didn't argue, but he took the folder back. "Lexi, if this is what I think it is, you need to be careful. Family doesn't exempt someone from consequences." I confronted my father by phone that night. I didn't accuse him directly. I simply asked if he'd been talking about my career to anyone outside the family. There was a pause, then I talked to whoever I want about whatever I want. You don't get to control that. I asked if he understood that discussing classified work, even in vague terms, could jeopardize national security. He laughed. National security. Is that what you call it? I call it a con job. You're so deep in their system you can't see you're being used. I told him I couldn't continue the conversation if he wouldn't acknowledge basic operational security. He said, then I guess we don't have anything to talk about, and hung up. I didn't call him back. That was 18 months before the gala. It happened at the Navy's annual gala, a black tie fundraiser held at a historic hotel in Washington, D.C., where senior officers mingled with defense contractors, civilian officials, and donors who supported military charities. I attended these events regularly as part of my duties, but this year was different. I'd been selected as one of the keynote speakers, asked to address the audience on the topic of leadership integrity in modern military service. The invitation was an honor, a recognition of my standing within the Navy, and I'd spent weeks preparing my remarks. I wore my full dress whites, ribbons lined precisely across my chest, representing deployments, commendations, and years of service. My father had been invited. I'd sent him an invitation months earlier, more out of obligation than hope. I never received an RSVP. The evening began normally. Cocktail hour in the grand ballroom, polite conversations with colleagues and civilians, the usual navigation of military social politics. I spoke briefly with Commander Rachel Torres, my executive officer on a recent assignment, who'd become a trusted friend. Nervous about the speech, she asked. I shook my head. I've briefed Joint Chiefs and congressional committees. I think I can handle a ballroom full of people in formal wear. She laughed, but there was something in her expression, a flicker of concern. Just be ready for anything, she said. These events can be unpredictable. I thought she was talking about technical difficulties or scheduling changes. I had no idea what was coming. Dinner was served at precisely 7:30. I sat at the head table with other senior officers and a few distinguished guests, making small talk about budgets and strategic priorities. At 8:15, I was scheduled to speak. At 8:10, I excused myself to review my notes one final time in a quiet corridor outside the ballroom. That's when I saw them, 3 uniformed Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents, walking toward me with purposeful strides, their expressions professionally blank. Behind them, 2 more agents in dark suits. My first thought was that there had been a security incident, that they needed to brief me on something urgent. Then I saw their hands move to their belts, and I understood. Captain Lexi Hale, the lead agent said, his voice carrying in the marble hallway. You're under arrest for treason against the United States. The words hung in the air like a physical object. I felt my training kick in, the same calm that had carried me through combat flight operations and high-pressure intelligence briefings. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply stood there as people began to emerge from the ballroom, drawn by the commotion. The lead agent, I would later learn his name was Agent Lewis, continued, "You are accused of transmitting classified intelligence to foreign contractors. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Gasps rippled through the growing crowd. I could see faces I recognized, colleagues, subordinates, people I'd worked with for years, all staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to confusion to something that looked like vindication. My mind was moving through possibilities at incredible speed. What intelligence? What contractors? What evidence could possibly support this accusation? None of it made sense, but the agents were already moving toward me with handcuffs. I didn't resist. I placed my hands behind my back and felt the cold metal close around my wrists. The lead agent began to guide me toward the exit, and that's when I saw him. My father stood near the bar at the edge of the ballroom entrance, his posture erect, his chin lifted in an expression I'd seen 1,000 times, the look of a man who believes he's done something righteous. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't embarrassed. He was watching the arrest with what I can only describe as satisfaction. As I was led past him, he stepped forward, and for a moment, I thought he might actually try to stop it, might intervene on my behalf. Instead, he spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'm the one who turned her in." The hallway went silent. Even the agents paused. He continued, his voice steady and clear. My daughter has been feeding intelligence to foreign contractors. I reported it to Naval Intelligence 3 weeks ago. I have documentation. I have evidence. I did my duty as a citizen and a veteran. The room froze. I could feel hundreds of eyes on us, could sense the weight of judgment and confusion pressing down from every direction. My father looked directly at me for the first time, and I saw something in his face that was worse than anger or disappointment. I saw pride. He was proud of this moment, proud of what he believed he'd exposed, proud that he'd chosen country over family. He thought he was a patriot. He thought he'd caught a traitor. The agents resumed moving me toward the exit, and I didn't look back at him. I didn't say anything. What could I possibly say in that moment that wouldn't sound like guilt or desperation? The silence followed me out of the hotel, into the back of an unmarked sedan, through the gates of a naval facility I'd visited dozens of times, but never under these circumstances. I was processed like any other suspect, photographed, fingerprinted, my uniform and personal effects inventoried and taken. They gave me standard-issue clothing and led me to an interrogation room, windowless, fluorescent lit, furnished with a metal table and 3 chairs. Agent Lewis sat across from me, flanked by a female agent whose name I didn't catch. He placed a file on the table, but didn't open it. "Captain Hale," he said, "do you understand the charges against you?" I looked at him and said the only thing I could say: I invoke my right to remain silent, and I request immediate contact with a JAG attorney. He nodded as if he'd expected this. "That's your right. But I want you to understand the situation. We have evidence of encrypted communications between your assigned devices and known foreign intelligence contacts. We have financial records showing unexplained deposits. We have testimony from a credible source, your father, a decorated Army colonel, detailing conversations where you allegedly discussed classified operations outside secure channels." I kept my expression neutral, but inside, I was reeling. Encrypted communications? Financial deposits? What was he talking about? More importantly, what had my father told them? "I have nothing to say without my attorney present," I repeated. Agent Lewis closed the file. "Then we'll wait. But Captain, I've been doing this for 20 years. The evidence we have doesn't look good. If there's an explanation, now is the time to start thinking about it." They left me alone in that room for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 90 minutes. I sat motionless, my mind working through everything I knew about operational security, about false accusations, about how investigations like this unfolded. The worst part wasn't the arrest itself, it was the public nature of it, the calculated cruelty of doing it at the gala, in front of everyone I worked with my father standing there claiming credit. That wasn't normal protocol. That was theater. Someone had wanted this to be as damaging as possible, and my father had been either their willing participant or their useful idiot. I didn't know which was worse. When my attorney finally arrived, a sharp-eyed JAG commander named Sarah Brennan, she spent 30 minutes reviewing the charges with me before allowing any further questioning. "They have communications logs," she said. "Encrypted messages sent from devices associated with your credentials. They have bank records showing deposits that don't match your known income. And they have your father's sworn statement claiming you discussed classified material with him inappropriately." I told her the truth. I had no knowledge of any unauthorized communications, no unexplained financial deposits, and I'd never discussed classified material with my father beyond the fact that I worked in intelligence. She believed me, but belief wasn't evidence. "We need to figure out how your credentials were used," she said. "And we need to do it fast, because the Navy is treating this as a major security breach." The interrogation resumed, this time with my attorney present. I answered the questions I could answer without violating classification protocols. Yes, I worked in naval intelligence. Yes, I had access to sensitive information. No, I had never transmitted classified material through unauthorized channels. No, I had never received money from foreign sources. The agents pressed harder, showing me printouts of messages I'd supposedly sent, bank statements for accounts I'd never opened. Everything looked legitimate, timestamps, IP addresses, account numbers, but none of it was mine. "Someone used my credentials," I said. Agent Lewis looked skeptical. "That's a common defense in espionage cases, Captain. You're going to need more than that. I looked at my attorney, then back at him. Then I suggest you start investigating who had access to my credentials, because I didn't send those messages, and those aren't my accounts. The session ended past midnight. They didn't release me. I was transferred to a holding facility on base, kept separate from general population, but still confined. As I lay on the narrow bunk in that cell, still wearing the issued clothing, I thought about my father standing in that hallway, announcing his betrayal to everyone who would listen. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to earn his respect, the money I'd sent, the care I'd provided, the patience I'd maintained in the face of his increasing hostility. And I realized that none of it had mattered. To him, I wasn't his daughter anymore. I was a symbol of everything he'd come to hate about the modern military, about authority he couldn't control, about a world that had moved beyond his understanding. He turned me in not because he had evidence of wrongdoing, but because arresting me proved something he needed to believe about himself. The betrayal was complete, and there was no coming back from it. The interrogation room was cold, clinical, designed to strip away comfort and replace it with the stark reality of accusation. For 72 hours, I was questioned by rotating teams of NCIS agents and naval intelligence officers who approached the investigation with professional detachment. They weren't hostile. In fact, they were almost apologetic in their thoroughness, but they were relentless. Every communication I'd sent, every operation I'd been involved in, every contact I'd made in my intelligence work was scrutinized for evidence of compromise. I answered what I could within the boundaries of classification protocols, and when I couldn't answer, I invoked the protection of my security clearance. My attorney, Commander Brennan, sat beside me through every session, occasionally interjecting when questions ventured into areas that could force me to violate my oath. The evidence against me was circumstantial, but superficially damning. Someone using credentials associated with my intelligence division accounts had sent encrypted messages to email addresses linked to foreign contractors, specifically companies with known ties to intelligence services of nations not aligned with U.S. interests. The messages themselves were carefully worded, never explicitly revealing classified information, but containing references and terminology that suggested insider knowledge. Financial records showed deposits into offshore accounts that bore my name and social security number, totaling over $200,000 across 18 months. On paper, it looked like a textbook case of espionage, a senior officer with access to sensitive intelligence, a pattern of suspicious communications, and unexplained financial gain. But there were inconsistencies that didn't fit the pattern of a careful spy. The encrypted messages had been sent during times when I was provably elsewhere, in meetings with witnesses, on flights with documented passenger manifests, even once during a live briefing I'd given to a congressional committee. The offshore accounts had been opened using online applications that originated from IP addresses I'd never accessed, including several in states I'd never visited. Most significantly, the communications had been sent from devices within my intelligence division's network, but forensic analysis showed that someone had used stolen credentials, my credentials, to access systems from terminals I'd never logged into. When NCIS brought in their digital forensics team, they found evidence of a sophisticated credential theft scheme that had compromised multiple officers' access codes. Captain Mark Danner, the naval intelligence officer who'd warned me months earlier about the forum posts, became instrumental in the investigation. He'd been tracking unusual access patterns in our classified systems, suspecting an insider threat but not knowing the scope. When my arrest became public, he immediately connected it to his investigation. The pattern matches other compromises we've been tracking, he told NCIS during a briefing I was later informed about. Someone inside the intelligence division has been systematically stealing credentials and using them to access and transmit classified information. Captain Hale isn't the perpetrator, she's one of the victims. That single statement shifted the direction of the investigation from proving my guilt to identifying the actual source of the breach. The breakthrough came on day 4 of my confinement. A cybersecurity contractor who'd been working on network security upgrades discovered anomalous activity on a shared server used by multiple intelligence officers. The server had a vulnerability, a backdoor that had been quietly installed during a routine maintenance update months earlier. That backdoor allowed someone with physical access to the server room to intercept credentials as officers logged in, then use those credentials to access classified systems from other terminals. Digital forensics traced the backdoor installation to a maintenance window that coincided with work performed by a civilian contractor named David Reeves, a former Navy technician who'd been hired by a private security firm. Reeves had the access, the technical knowledge, and as investigators quickly discovered, the financial motive. He'd been selling stolen intelligence to foreign contacts for over 2 years. When NCIS arrested Reeves, he confessed within hours. He'd been targeting high-ranking officers specifically because their credentials provided access to the most valuable intelligence. He'd used my credentials for several transmissions because my assignment to Joint Intelligence Operations gave him access to information worth significant money on the black market. He'd even created the offshore accounts in my name as a crude attempt at misdirection, thinking that if he was ever caught, the financial trail would point to his victims rather than himself. In his confession, he mentioned that he'd chosen his targets based partly on publicly available information, including details about officers' personal lives that might make them seem vulnerable to recruitment or blackmail. My father's increasingly public criticism of me, his social media posts questioning military leadership, had apparently made me look like a potentially compromised officer. By day 6, I was officially exonerated. The Secretary of the Navy himself called to apologize, to assure me that the Navy would make a public statement clearing my name and detailing the real source of the security breach. Commander Brennan delivered the news in person, her expression a mixture of relief and residual anger. "You're free to go, Captain. All charges dropped. They're preparing a press release now." I asked about my father's role in the accusation. She hesitated, then said, his statement to NCIS was based on misunderstandings and speculation. He claimed you'd discussed classified work with him, that you'd seemed nervous about money, that you'd made comments about questioning the chain of command. None of it was actually evidence, but it gave the initial investigation enough smoke to justify the arrest. He won't be charged with filing a false report because NCIS believes he genuinely thought he was reporting suspicious activity. Genuinely thought. The phrase echoed in my mind as I changed back into my uniform, as I signed the release papers, as I walked out of the facility into daylight that felt harsh after days of fluorescent lighting. My father had genuinely thought I was a traitor. He genuinely believed that arresting me at the gala, in front of everyone, was an act of patriotism. He'd been wrong about every factual detail, but his certainty had never wavered. I thought about calling him, demanding an explanation or an apology, but I knew it would be pointless. In his mind, he'd done the right thing. The fact that I'd been cleared wouldn't change his fundamental belief that I'd betrayed him by choosing my career over his approval. The Navy's public statement was released within 24 hours. It detailed the arrest and exoneration of multiple officers whose credentials had been compromised, identified David Reeves as the actual perpetrator, and included a paragraph specifically clearing me of all suspicion. My commanding officer at the time, Vice Admiral Patricia Morrison, called me personally. "Lexi, I'm sorry this happened. The investigation was necessary given the evidence, but I never doubted your integrity. We'll make sure your record reflects that you were a victim of a sophisticated security breach, not a suspect in a legitimate investigation." I thanked her, but her reassurance felt hollow. The damage had already been done. Every officer and civilian who'd witnessed my arrest would remember that moment regardless of the exoneration. Suspicion, once planted, doesn't disappear just because it's proven false. The hardest part wasn't the interrogation or the confinement, it was the aftermath, the slow process of re-earning trust that shouldn't have been in question in the first place. Colleagues who'd known me for years would pause before sharing information, as if some part of them wondered whether the charges might have been true. Officers I'd mentored avoided eye contact in hallways. At meetings, there was a moment of hesitation when I spoke, a subtle weighing of my words that hadn't existed before. Commander Torres was one of the few who treated me exactly as she had before. "Anyone who knows you knows that arrest was bullshit," she said over coffee a week after my release. The rest of them can learn or stay ignorant. Your call how much energy you spend on it. I spent months re-earning that trust through the only method I knew, impeccable work. I took on additional responsibilities, volunteered for complex assignments, and maintained such rigorous operational security that my division became a model for best practices. I didn't complain about the false accusation. I didn't publicly discuss my father's role. I simply worked, channeling the betrayal and humiliation into discipline and focus. Slowly, the whispers faded. My performance reviews remained outstanding. My next promotion timeline stayed on track. But something had changed in how I viewed my service. I'd always believed that competence and integrity were their own protection, that doing the right thing consistently would shield you from unjust accusations. The arrest had proven that false. Even the most exemplary record could be undermined by circumstantial evidence and the willing testimony of someone who claimed to know you. I didn't reach out to my father. I didn't call, didn't write, didn't send updates about my life or career. For the first time in my adult life, I simply stopped trying. If he wanted to apologize, he knew how to find me. If he wanted to acknowledge that he'd been wrong, that his accusation had nearly destroyed my career and reputation, he could make that effort. Months passed, then a year, then longer. He never called. According to family members I still spoke to, he continued to follow talk radio programs and conspiracy theorists who validated his worldview. He told relatives that I'd been cleared on a technicality, that the real truth about military corruption would eventually come out. He never admitted he'd been wrong. In his mind, he'd done his duty, and if I'd been exonerated, it was because the system was protecting its own. That was the last time I tried to reconcile who he actually was with who I'd always needed him to be. The man I'd spent my life trying to please didn't exist. He never had. Years passed. Time moved forward the way it does in military service, marked by deployments, assignments, promotions, and the steady accumulation of experience that transforms junior officers into senior leaders. I advanced from captain to commodore, and then to rear admiral lower half at 43, a promotion that came earlier than I'd expected, but which my superiors assured me was based entirely on merit and performance. The arrest and exoneration had become a footnote in my service record, officially noted as falsely accused due to credential compromise and marked resolved. But footnotes have a way of lingering in institutional memory, showing up in background checks and security reviews, requiring explanation even when there's nothing to explain. I learned through family channels that my father had continued his decline into conspiracy-driven thinking. After my exoneration, he'd briefly gone quiet, but within months, he'd resumed his pattern of public criticism of military leadership. He'd started a blog where he posted lengthy essays about corruption in the Department of Defense, about officers who'd supposedly betrayed their oaths, about the need for civilian oversight of rogue intelligence operations. The blog had a small but dedicated following among people who shared his worldview, veterans who felt betrayed by modernization, civilians who distrusted government institutions, and the usual collection of conspiracy theorists who saw patterns in everything. His posts never mentioned me by name, but they referenced family members in naval intelligence and personal knowledge of how the system protects its own. Then, 3 years after my exoneration, I received a call from Vice Admiral Morrison, who'd since become the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Information Warfare. "Lexi, we have a situation," she said without preamble. "Your father has been giving interviews to a media outlet that specializes in defense industry coverage. He's positioning himself as a whistleblower with insider knowledge of intelligence corruption. The outlet is treating him as a credible source because of his military background and his relationship to you." She paused, and I could hear the frustration in her silence. The content is mostly paranoid speculation, but he's mixing in just enough factual detail about how intelligence operations work that it's causing problems. "We need to address this." The outlet was an online news organization that occupied the gray space between legitimate journalism and conspiracy theorizing. They'd published several articles featuring my father's claims about systemic corruption in naval intelligence, about officers who prioritize career advancement over national security, and about classification being used to hide wrongdoing rather than protect legitimate secrets. Each article included his credentials, retired Army colonel, father of a naval flag officer, as evidence of his authority to make these claims. The articles never directly accused anyone of specific crimes, but they created an atmosphere of suspicion that was damaging to the intelligence community's ability to recruit and retain personnel. I made my decision without hesitation. For years, I'd remained silent about his false accusation, had chosen dignity over defense, had let my record speak for itself. But now he was actively harming not just my reputation, but the entire institution I'd served my whole adult life. I contacted the Navy's Public Affairs Office and authorized them to release a formal statement addressing his claims. The statement, which I reviewed and approved before publication, was direct and unsparing. Retired Army Colonel Richard Hale has made repeated public claims about corruption within naval intelligence based on what he characterizes as personal knowledge. These claims are factually incorrect and appear to stem from a fundamental misunderstanding of how classified operations work. Colonel Hale has no direct knowledge of naval intelligence operations and has never been granted access to classified information related to these matters. His previous accusations against senior officers, including his own daughter, have been thoroughly investigated and found to be without merit. The statement went further. With authorization from the Secretary of the Navy, I requested the declassification and release of specific records related to my 2019 arrest, including the forensic evidence that proved my credentials had been stolen, the confession of the actual perpetrator, and most significantly, the assessment that Colonel Hale's initial report to NCIS had been based entirely on speculation rather than evidence. The declassified documents made clear that while he hadn't been charged with filing a false report, investigators had concluded his accusations were without factual foundation and based on personal grievances rather than legitimate security concerns. The release was strategic and surgical. I didn't grant interviews or make public appearances to discuss my father. I simply ensured that the factual record was available to anyone who wanted to verify his claims. The effect was immediate and comprehensive. The media outlet that had been publishing his accusations issued a correction and removed several articles from their website. Other publications that had cited him as a source on military matters stopped returning his calls. His blog traffic, which had never been substantial, dropped to nearly nothing. Most devastatingly for him, the consulting clients he still maintained, small defense contractors who valued his Army background, quietly ended their relationships. His credentials as a military expert, the one thing he'd built his post-retirement identity around, were now publicly questioned. Within a week, he called me for the first time in 3 years. I was in my office at the Pentagon, reviewing intelligence briefings, when my personal phone rang with a number I'd never deleted, but had long since stopped expecting to see. I let it go to voicemail. He called again an hour later. And again that evening. On the fourth call, I answered. "This is Rear Admiral Hale," I said, using my rank deliberately. There was a long pause, then his voice, smaller than I'd ever heard it. "You destroyed me." Not, "Hello," not, "I'm sorry," not, "Can we talk?" Just accusation, just blame, as if I'd acted first rather than responded to years of his attacks. "I released factual information," I said evenly. "Everything in that statement is documented and verifiable. If that destroyed you, it's because your credibility was built on false claims." He tried to argue, his voice rising. "You didn't have to make it public. You could have called me. You could have asked me to stop. You didn't have to ruin my reputation." I felt something in my chest, not anger exactly, but a cold clarity I'd never experienced with him before. "You arrested me at a public gala," I said. "You announced to everyone there that you'd turned in your own daughter for treason. You didn't call me first. You didn't ask questions. You wanted the truth out, Dad. Now it's out. All of it." The silence stretched between us, and I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, not angry anymore, but frightened. "I have no income now. The contractors dropped me. Nobody will hire me for consulting. I don't know how I'm going to pay my bills." I thought about all the years I'd sent him money, all the times I'd bailed him out financially, all the support I'd provided that he'd never acknowledged or appreciated. I thought about the moment he'd stood in that hallway and claimed credit for my arrest while I was led away in handcuffs. "You set the terms," I said quietly. "You wanted everyone to know you'd chosen truth over family loyalty. You got what you wanted. You're a patriot who reported suspected wrongdoing. The fact that you were wrong doesn't make you less committed to your principles." He started to protest, to explain, to justify his actions. I cut him off. "I'm not interested in your reasons anymore. You made your choice when you turned me in without evidence. You made it again when you spent years publicly questioning my integrity. You made it every time you prioritized your conspiracy theories over your relationship with your daughter. I didn't destroy you, Dad. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own actions." He was quiet for a moment, then said something I hadn't expected. "You sound just like them now. Cold. Calculating. That's what they turned you into." I almost laughed at the irony. He'd spent my entire life demanding I be disciplined, strategic, emotionally controlled, and now he was accusing me of being exactly what he'd trained me to be. "I'm going to hang up now," I said. "If you need help with immediate financial survival, I'll make sure you're not homeless. But I'm done being your target, and I'm done pretending we have a relationship worth salvaging. You wanted the truth out. Now you have to live with it." I ended the call before he could respond. True to my word, I arranged for a modest monthly payment to be sent to him, enough to cover basic expenses, but nothing more. It was routed through a family trust so he wouldn't have to accept it directly from me, preserving whatever dignity he had left. I did it not because he deserved it, but because my mother would have wanted me to ensure he wasn't destitute. But there would be no more conversations, no more attempts at reconciliation, no more hope that he would somehow become the father I'd always needed. Commander Torres found me that evening in my office, still at my desk though it was well past normal working hours. She didn't ask what was wrong, she just sat in the chair across from me and waited. Finally, I said, "I released the records about my father's false accusation. He called today. He's lost his consulting work." She nodded slowly. "How do you feel about that?" I considered the question honestly. "I feel nothing. And that scares me more than if I felt angry or guilty or satisfied. I just feel nothing." She leaned forward. "You protected the institution and cleared your name. Those are both right actions. What he's experiencing now isn't your doing. It's the natural consequence of lying about someone in a way that's publicly verifiable. You didn't make him do that." "He's my father," I said. "Shouldn't I feel something?" Torres shook her head. "He stopped being your father the moment he had you arrested on false charges. What you're feeling or not feeling is healthy detachment from someone who's spent years trying to destroy you. Don't confuse that with being cold. You're just finally protecting yourself." She was right, but the absence of emotion still felt wrong somehow. I'd spent my entire life trying to earn his love, and now that I'd finally stopped trying, the space where that effort had been was just empty. Not painful, not liberating, just empty. "The hardest lesson," Torres said, standing to leave, "is that some people can't be saved, even by the people who love them most. Especially by those people." After she left, I sat in my office looking at the photo on my desk, a picture from my promotion to captain, my mother's face visible in the crowd behind me, smiling with uncomplicated pride. My father had been in that crowd too, though he'd left before the photo was taken. I'd kept the picture because of my mother, but now I realized I'd also kept it because some part of me had still been hoping. Hoping he'd change, hoping he'd finally see me, hoping that the next achievement would be the one that broke through his wall of resentment and disappointment. That hope was gone now, and in its place was something more sustainable: certainty. Certainty that I'd done everything possible, that his failures were his own, and that I could stop carrying responsibility for his choices. The official fallout from releasing the records was minimal. A few news outlets covered the story as an example of how stolen credentials could compromise even senior officers, using my case as a cautionary tale about cybersecurity. My father was mentioned only in passing, identified as a family member who mistakenly reported suspicions that were later disproven. The narrative framed him as a concerned citizen who'd made an understandable error rather than as a vindictive parent, which was probably more generous than he deserved. But I hadn't released the records to punish him publicly. I'd done it to protect the institution from his continued false accusations. That his personal consequences were severe was simply the natural result of being publicly wrong about something he'd claimed special knowledge about. In the months that followed, I focused on my work with renewed purpose. I chaired a joint task force on intelligence sharing between services, mentored junior officers who were navigating their own career challenges, and maintained the rigorous standards that had defined my service from the beginning. Justice had come, but not through dramatic confrontation or satisfying revenge. It had come through documentation, through the quiet power of factual records, through letting the truth speak without embellishment or emotion. That was the hardest lesson. Real power isn't about striking back or making others suffer. It's about building something strong enough that attacks can't diminish it, and maintaining your integrity when attacking back would be easier. My father had tried to destroy my career and reputation. In responding, I'd simply ensured that anyone who checked could verify the truth. That wasn't vengeance. That was survival. He reached out again years later, when I was 49 and serving as a Rear Admiral upper half, overseeing a division that coordinated intelligence operations across 3 theater commands. The message came through my cousin, the same one who'd warned me years earlier about his talk radio obsession. "Your father's in a veterans hospital," she told me over the phone. "He had a stroke. Not major, but enough to scare him. He's asking for you." I felt that familiar emptiness where a daughter's concern should have been. "What does he want?" I asked. My cousin hesitated. "I think he wants to apologize. He's different now, frail, alone. I think he finally understands what he did." I didn't respond immediately. I had a full schedule, briefings, meetings, a deployment timeline to review. But that night, lying awake in my quarters, I thought about the man who'd raised me with rigid discipline and impossible standards, who'd loved the idea of military service, but couldn't accept what it actually meant in his daughter's life. I thought about my mother, who'd spent her life mediating between us, who died believing we'd eventually find our way back to each other. And I thought about the fact that I had the power now, not just rank, but actual authority over how this story ended. I could refuse to see him, could let him die without that conversation, and no one would blame me. Or I could go, not for him, but to close something that had been open too long. 2 weeks later, I drove to the Veterans Hospital in suburban Maryland. It was a modern facility, well-maintained, filled with men and women who'd served and were now navigating the final stages of life with varying degrees of grace and support. I wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple sweater, because I didn't want this meeting to be about rank or position. The nurses directed me to his room on the 3rd floor. I stood outside the door for a full minute, steadying myself, before I knocked and entered. He was sitting in a chair by the window, thinner than I remembered, his face carrying the slack expression common to stroke survivors. His left hand trembled slightly in his lap. When he saw me, something in his eyes changed, not the pride or judgment I'd grown up with, but something closer to shame. "Lexi," he said, and even his voice was different, softer and uncertain. "You came." I pulled a chair from against the wall and sat across from him, maintaining distance. "I came," I confirmed. "My cousin said you wanted to talk." He nodded, his trembling hand moving to his face as if to steady himself. I wanted to say, he stopped, struggling with the words. "I need you to know that I was wrong." The apology I'd waited my entire life for, and now that it was here, I felt nothing but tired. "About which part?" I asked, and there was no malice in the question, just genuine curiosity. "The arrest? The years of public accusations? The fact that you've spent the last decade trying to destroy my reputation?" He flinched at each item. "All of it," he said quietly. "I thought turning you in would prove I wasn't the villain. I thought if I could show that even my own daughter had been corrupted by the system, it would validate everything I believed about military leadership. I thought," he stopped, tears visible in his eyes. "I thought you'd chosen them over me, and I couldn't accept that I'd raised a daughter who didn't need me anymore." There it was, the truth underneath all the accusations and betrayals. He hadn't reported me because he genuinely believed I was a traitor. He'd done it because my success, my independence, my rise through ranks he'd never achieved made him feel obsolete and abandoned. He'd tried to destroy me because he couldn't accept that I'd become someone he couldn't control or diminish. You were never the villain in my story, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. You were just my father. I spent my whole life trying to earn your approval, trying to make you proud, trying to be good enough for you to love. And you spent that whole time resenting me for succeeding at the thing you'd taught me to value. I don't know how to forgive that. I don't even know if I want to. He was crying now, tears running down his weathered face. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I need you to understand, I thought I was doing the right thing. When I turned you in, I genuinely believed you'd betrayed your oath. I believed it because I needed to believe it, because believing you were corrupt meant I hadn't failed as a father. I was wrong. About all of it. And I've spent every day, since your exoneration, knowing I destroyed the only thing that really mattered. His voice broke. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to hear it before I die. I sat with his apology, examining it for sincerity and finding what I'd never expected to find, genuine remorse. Not the self-serving kind that seeks absolution or restoration, but the kind that simply acknowledges damage done. I hear you, I said finally. I hear that you're sorry. I hear that you understand what you did. But Dad, you need to understand something too. You didn't just accuse me of treason. You didn't just try to destroy my career. You took the one thing I'd built my entire life around, my integrity, my service, my oath, and you tried to turn it into evidence of betrayal. You arrested me publicly, humiliated me in front of everyone I'd ever worked with, and then spent years continuing to question my loyalty. That doesn't just go away because you finally realized you were wrong. He nodded, accepting the judgment without argument. I know. I'm not asking for your forgiveness or for us to have a relationship again. I know that's impossible now. He looked at me directly for the first time, really looked at me, and I saw a father seeing his daughter as a fully realized person rather than a reflection of his own needs. I just wanted you to know that I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you. I was just too broken to show it, and by the time I understood that, I'd already destroyed any chance of being part of your life. You became everything I wanted to be and couldn't. And instead of celebrating that, I tried to tear it down. That's my failure, not yours. You don't owe me anything. The room was quiet except for the distant sounds of the hospital, monitors beeping, nurses conversing in the hallway, the low hum of institutional life. I thought about all the things I could say, all the ways I could respond to this moment. I could be cruel, could enumerate every hurt and betrayal, could make him feel the full weight of what he'd done. I could be gracious, could offer the forgiveness he wasn't asking for, could pretend that his apology somehow repaired the damage. Or I could simply be honest. I don't forgive you, I said. I don't know if I ever will. But I understand you better now, and that's more than I expected to get from this conversation. He accepted this with a small nod. That's more than I deserve. We sat in silence for a moment, and then I stood. I wasn't ready to leave yet, but I wasn't sure what else needed to be said. Then, surprising myself, I moved to attention and offered him a salute, crisp, formal, the gesture of respect one service member gives another. Not a daughter's salute to a father, but a flag officer's acknowledgement of a retired soldier who'd once served honorably before his demons consumed him. He looked up at me, confusion and gratitude mixing in his expression, and managed to return the salute with his trembling right hand. Admiral, he whispered, and in that single word I heard everything he'd never been able to say. Pride, regret, recognition, loss. I left the hospital and didn't return. He died 4 months later, another stroke, this one massive and final. My cousin called to tell me, and I arranged for a military funeral with full honors, because whatever he'd become at the end, he'd served his country with distinction for 30 years. I attended the service in full dress uniform, stood with the other mourners as the flag was folded and presented, and felt the same emptiness I'd felt for years. Other veterans who'd served with him spoke about his leadership, his dedication, his commitment to the men under his command. None of them mentioned our relationship, and I was grateful for that small mercy. At the reception after the funeral, distant relatives approached me with condolences and questions about reconciliation. "Did you get a chance to make peace with him before he passed?" an uncle asked. I chose my words carefully. "We had a conversation. He apologized. I heard him. That's as close to peace as we were going to get." The uncle nodded, satisfied with that answer, and moved on. Only my cousin stayed behind, studying my face. "Are you okay?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. "I'm fine. I mourn the father I needed years ago. The man who died last week was someone I understood but never really knew. I'm not grieving. I'm just closing a chapter." Forgiveness, I'd realized during that final conversation, didn't mean restoration. It didn't mean pretending the betrayal hadn't happened or that the damage wasn't permanent. It didn't even necessarily mean letting go of anger or hurt. It just meant acknowledging that the person who'd harmed you was human, flawed, driven by their own pain and failures, and that understanding their brokenness didn't require you to accept them back into your life. I didn't forgive my father in the sense that our relationship was repaired. But I'd released the hope that it ever could be repaired, and in that release was a kind of freedom I'd never experienced before. Before leaving the reception, I took one of the memorial cards, a photo of him from his army years, young and confident and unburdened by the resentments that would define his later life. I kept it not as a remembrance of the man he'd become, but as a reminder of the man he'd been before his demons consumed him. And I kept it as a reminder to myself that service and integrity mean nothing if they're not paired with grace toward those you lead, and that power without empathy becomes just another form of tyranny. My father had taught me discipline and standards and the importance of excellence. But it was his failures, his inability to love what he couldn't control, his need to diminish what threatened his ego, that taught me the more important lesson, that being right isn't enough if it costs you the ability to see others as fully human. Years later, at another gala, a different venue, but the same essential purpose, I stood again in dress whites, ribbons precisely aligned across my chest, representing 3 decades of service. I was 51 now, a rear admiral with enough time and grade that promotion to vice admiral was a realistic possibility if I wanted it. The hall was filled with officers and civilians I'd worked with over the years, people who knew me as competent, reserved, and occasionally difficult to read emotionally. Secretary Donovan, who'd been an undersecretary during my false arrest and had personally ensured my exoneration was handled correctly, approached me before the ceremony. "Admiral Hale," he said warmly. "It's good to see you here. Different circumstances than last time." He was referring, of course, to the arrest that had happened in a similar venue years earlier. I smiled slightly. Very different. Though I admit I still tense up slightly when I see NCIS agents at these events. He laughed, but there was understanding in his expression. "That's trauma, and it's valid. But you should know everyone who knows your record knows what really happened. You're not remembered for being arrested. You're remembered for how you handled being exonerated and never let it define your career." I thanked him, appreciating the acknowledgement, and he moved on to greet other guests. The truth was more complicated than he suggested. Some people did remember me primarily for the arrest, because scandal is always more memorable than competence. But enough people knew the full story that I'd been able to rebuild trust and continue advancing. When I was introduced as the evening's keynote speaker, the same role I'd been about to fill when I was arrested years earlier, the applause felt different. Not just polite recognition, but something warmer, more genuine. I stepped to the podium and looked out at the crowd, noting faces I recognized, Commander Torres, now a captain herself, Captain Danner, who'd helped uncover the real perpetrator of the credential theft. Young officers I'd mentored who were now rising through their own career paths. I'd prepared remarks about the evolution of military leadership in an age of rapid technological change, but standing there, I felt compelled to address something more personal. I was supposed to give this speech 7 years ago, I began, departing from my prepared text. Most of you know what happened instead. I was arrested in a room much like this one, accused of treason, and let out in handcuffs while my colleagues watched. I was completely exonerated within a week, but the experience changed how I understood service, leadership, and resilience. The room had gone quiet, everyone leaning forward slightly. I don't talk about this often because I don't want to be defined by something that was done to me rather than by what I've accomplished. But tonight feels like the right time to acknowledge that our careers, all of our careers, include moments of unjust accusation, professional betrayal, and tests of character that we never anticipated. I continued, choosing each word carefully. The lesson I learned wasn't about vindication or revenge. It was about the difference between justice and satisfaction. When you're wronged publicly, there's a temptation to demand public restoration, to make everyone who doubted you acknowledge their mistake. But real professional resilience means continuing to do excellent work regardless of whether everyone recognizes it. It means building a reputation so solid that one false accusation can't destroy it. It means accepting that some people will always remember the accusation more than the exoneration, and doing the work anyway. The applause started before I finished the thought, and I paused to let it settle before delivering my prepared remarks on leadership and technology. After the speech, dozens of people approached me, some to thank me for addressing the arrest directly, others to share their own stories of professional setbacks and recovery. A young lieutenant commander, someone I didn't recognize, waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. "Admiral, I just wanted to thank you for what you said about continuing despite false accusations. 2 years ago, I was investigated for a security violation I didn't commit. I was cleared, but some people still treat me like I'm a risk. Hearing you talk about it, someone at your level who went through something similar, it helps." I gave her my full attention. The people who matter know the truth. The people who don't know the truth but assume the worst aren't worth your energy. Keep doing excellent work. That's the only answer that matters. Later that evening, as the formal portion of the event concluded and people moved to the reception, I stood alone for a moment near the same corridor where I'd been arrested years earlier. Commander Torres found me there, 2 glasses of wine in her hands. She offered me one without speaking, and we stood together looking at the space that had once been the site of my greatest professional humiliation. "Do you ever regret not fighting back harder?" she asked. "Not releasing the record sooner, not going public with your father's role?" I considered the question. No. Fighting back on his timeline, in his terms, would have meant letting him control the narrative. Waiting until he forced my hand by continuing to attack the institution, that was my choice, my timing. That mattered. "He died thinking you'd destroyed him," Torres observed. It wasn't a question or a judgment, just a statement of fact. "He destroyed himself," I corrected. "I just stopped preventing the consequences of his actions from reaching him." "There's a difference." She nodded, sipping her wine. "You know what I've always admired about how you handled this? You never became bitter. Angry, yes. Hurt, absolutely. But never bitter, never twisted by it. You could have let that arrest make you cynical about service, about loyalty, about whether integrity matters. Instead, you just kept being excellent. That's real strength." I smiled slightly. I don't know if it's strength or just stubbornness. Maybe they're the same thing at a certain level. As the evening wound down, I found myself thinking about my father's deathbed words. "I thought turning you in would prove I wasn't the villain." In his mind, he'd been trying to prove something about himself by destroying me. In mine, I'd been trying to prove something about myself by succeeding despite him. We'd both been trapped in a narrative where our relationship was fundamentally about proving worth rather than simply accepting and loving each other. The difference was that I'd eventually recognized the trap and walked away from it. He'd stayed in it until it consumed him completely. That was the real tragedy, not that he'd betrayed me, but that he'd imprisoned himself in a worldview where betraying me was the only way he could feel righteous. I left the gala that night feeling something I hadn't expected: closure. Not because my father had apologized or because I'd forgiven him, but because I'd finally stopped needing anything from that relationship. I'd proven everything I needed to prove, not to him, but to myself. I was an admiral not because I'd overcome his betrayal, but because I'd done the work regardless of his betrayal. My success wasn't a response to his failure. It was simply the result of 3 decades of disciplined service, ethical decision-making, and commitment to something larger than personal grievance. He'd tried to make my career about him, about his approval, his validation, his judgment. In the end, my career was exactly what it should have been: about service, about leadership, about maintaining integrity when doing so is difficult. Commander Torres drove me home that night, both of us quiet in the car. As we pulled up to my townhouse in Alexandria, she said, "You know what the real victory is? You're nothing like him." He let his resentments define him, let his need for control consume every relationship. You learn from that. You lead without needing to diminish. You support without needing credit. You maintain standards without destroying people who don't meet them immediately. You're the officer he could have been if he'd been capable of celebrating other people's success instead of feeling threatened by it. I thanked her and climbed out of the car, standing for a moment on my front steps looking at the quiet street, the neat row of townhouses where other military officers and government workers live their ordered, purposeful lives. Inside, I changed out of my uniform and sat in my living room with a cup of tea, the way I did most nights after long days. On my bookshelf was the memorial card from my father's funeral, tucked between two books on naval strategy. I took it down and looked at the photo, that young Army officer, full of confidence and promise, before disappointment and resentment had hardened him into someone unrecognizable. I wondered what he would think if he could see me now, if that younger version of himself could have known what his daughter would accomplish. Would he have been proud? Or would that officer, too, have felt threatened by a daughter who exceeded his achievements? I would never know, and the not knowing had finally stopped mattering. I thought about the young lieutenant commander who'd approached me after my speech, struggling with the lingering effects of her own false accusation. I thought about the junior officers I'd mentored over the years, some of whom had faced their own challenges with integrity and resilience. I thought about Commander Torres, who'd stayed loyal when loyalty wasn't convenient or career advancing. These were the relationships that define my service now, bonds built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine care rather than on blood obligation or desperate attempts to earn approval. These were the people who saw me clearly and chose to work alongside me anyway. That was the real victory, more meaningful than any rank or award, building a professional life surrounded by people who shared my values and reflected them back to me. The next morning, I returned to work at the Pentagon, reviewed intelligence briefings, met with my staff, and continued the daily work of serving my country. The gala was behind me. The speech was done. My father's ghost had been acknowledged and released. I was 51 years old, a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, and I had built a life that was exactly what I'd always wanted it to be: purposeful, ethical, challenging, and entirely my own. Not because I'd overcome my father's betrayal, but because I'd stopped letting his betrayal define what was possible. The ultimate vindication isn't making others bow or forcing them to acknowledge their mistakes. It's standing tall in your own integrity, doing work that matters, and building a life that reflects your values regardless of who recognizes or appreciates it. My father had tried to destroy me. Instead, he'd simply revealed that I was strong enough to survive his destruction and continue serving anyway. And that resilience, that commitment, that refusal to be diminished was the only victory that ever really mattered. Here's where I'll leave it. If this hit home, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that boundaries are strength, not disrespect. Drop a comment, I read them. Questions for you: have you ever been publicly called out by family? What did you do next? Would you have gone no contact after the gala or tried to reconcile later? Where do you draw the line between loyalty to family and loyalty to your values? If a parent accused you without evidence, what would accountability look like? Do you believe forgiveness requires restoration, or can it be separate? For those who've rebuilt after betrayal, what one boundary changed everything? Thanks for being here. Your story might help someone else stand their ground.